Welcome to another episode of Friends in Wonder, a place where we invite you to explore meaningful topics without judgment or limits.
Brought to you by two lifelong friends sharing their insights.
I'm Joe Luther.
And I'm Vince Kern.
And we've got great topics lined up for you each week, so be sure to subscribe, like, and even share with your friends.
Hey, honey, what you doing? Napping at your computer again?
No, I'm just trying to figure out which of the topics on our show calendar I can do by myself for this week's podcast episode.
What do you mean, by yourself? What happened to Friend in Wonder Joe?
Well, he and Sonia are in Cozumel this week. A little winter time away from here.
Yeah? So?
What do you mean, yeah, so?
Well, so why don't you do a show on Cozumel? You know that one show we used to watch with Ricky Gervais, An Idiot Abroad? Only instead, he's a co-host abroad.
Yeah, but they're on vacation.
Yeah, but I don't think the Friends in Wonder audience wants to listen to you for a whole show. You should call him.
But...
Call him.
All right. Well, hello, Yucatan Peninsula. Joe, are you there?
I am here, Vince, with the modern technology of the internet. How you doing?
Hey, I'm not too bad. I can hear you. We got a good signal. So let's talk a little bit about where you are and what it's like. You're in Cozumel. Is that correct?
That is correct. And so technically I'm not on the Yucatan Peninsula. We're just 20 miles off of it. Cozumel being an island directly across from Playa del Carmen, which most people are familiar with, the Gulf of Mexico, which, kind of starts with Florida and curls around through Texas and in Mexico. And then there's the Yucatan Peninsula, which kind of points back up at Florida, is very close to pointing at Cuba, in fact. And we're basically on the opposite side of that peninsula on the little island of Cozumel. Actually, I think we're looking at the Caribbean Sea, not the Gulf of Mexico.
That's interesting because I'm not a geographic expert of Mexico by any means. And when I looked on a map, I didn't realize how close you are to Cuba. It's to the northeast a little bit, right?
Right. I don't know how far it is, so don't be throwing those kind of questions at me.
All right.
I'm going to guess like 80 miles or something like that. And I guess.
And then it's part of Central America. Is that correct?
Right. Well, Mexico is, I don't really know where Central America starts and ends according to the borders, but certainly this connection of land between North America and South America is known. The people here call it Mesoamerica. There's a number of countries that are part of that, like Guatemala and Costa Rica and Belize, and I can't name them all, but yes, we are in Central or Mesoamerica.
So what was it that attracted you for this destination when you were planning to go here? I know back here we've got fallen trees and branches and power outages, and you like to get away from that. So you had planned this trip in advance. This wasn't an escape from America trip.
Right. It wasn't a spontaneous escape from America or from the winters of America trip, but it was definitely a planned escape from the winter because we like to get at least a week or two south in the middle of the winter to break it up. It sometimes gets a little monotonous, get our natural form of vitamin D. So mostly this was a trip to come south and be on a beach somewhere where it isn't too crazy with spring break kind of activity. And doing a little research, it seemed as though this island is far more laid back than other areas of Mexico, because with Mexico, you've got the legal age of drinking at 18 years old, and that seems to attract a lot of seniors in high school because many of them can drink legally down here. So it's a very popular destination for spring break youngsters, and we wanted to avoid that. So this fit all the particulars for avoiding that.
And you always like to go to places that are culturally enlightening, I suppose is one way of saying it. Tell me what it was about Cozumel that we're interested in, and were you surprised at what you found? How did you find it? Was it more or less cultural than you thought?
Well, yeah, it's a good question because I've always wanted to see the Mayan ruins. I've been fascinated with the Mayan culture since reading about them in historical outlines and books in high school, probably. And there's pyramids. Like people always are amazed that there's pyramids in Egypt, but we have pyramids here and on this side of the Pacific, Atlantic, whatever, and right here in the Yucatan Peninsula. And Chichen Itza is the Mayan ruin that many people have seen. I think it's even now one of the seven man-made wonders of the world. And I've always wanted to see that and was hopeful that from Cozumel we'd be able to at least see some parts of the Mayan ruins. And yeah, so that was part of the draw here, is to get some time on the beach and maybe spend a little time looking into the Mayan culture.
Well, you were telling me that the excavation of that particular what did you call that triangular thing? A pyramid. There you go.
Yeah, they're temples. They're not like, well, but I guess it's similar to the Egyptian.
But you were telling me that the excavation of those didn't really begin, or they weren't really found until the 1800s. So this is a relatively new finding. And can you talk a little bit about your experience with what you saw, how you felt, what you learned?
Well, it's fascinating because the Mayan culture it's kind of a murky. Well, I guess the archaeologists are only piecing it together in the last couple of hundred years, but the Mayan civilization is by far the oldest civilization in North America. You have kind of the Aztecs to the north and the Incas to the south. And here in Central America, the Mayans go back. They're not really sure yet. Thousands of years, most likely before the Greeks had civilization. So this civilization is very deep in history. And what's interesting is that these ruins were covered in jungle, and maybe the locals knew about it, but when the European explorers came and began to learn more and more about the area, they stumbled onto this. And I don't know exactly when they stumbled onto it, but like you said, they didn't begin archaeologically uncovering Chichen Itza until the 1800s. They've been piecing it together ever since, and they keep finding out more. They find out that there's huge amounts of these structures all around. It was a huge area, many, many miles. I don't know if it's hundreds of miles, but a huge area that was civilized and had these types of structures connected to this big one that's at Chichen Itza.
So it sounds like some of the migration might have come up from southward. And then in North America, you had Indian tribes. And it feels like, the Aztecs and the Incas obviously were related to the North American Indian tribes, right? Because they all came together and continued on northward. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, and I would think that a lot of the difference between maybe Aztecs and Native Americans of the United States are man-made by us European border drawers, because I'm sure that they were very similar. But when we're talking about the Mayans, though, we're talking about a culture that goes back much further in terms of being an organized civilization. And the Aztecs and the Incas and the native North Americans were more hunter-gatherers, whereas the Mayans were very much a settled civilization, and they had farming. And this goes back a long way. And really, many historians believe it might be the oldest civilization, although I don't really know who wants to take that claim, but it goes back very, very long way.
Mostly Mayan culture where you are. What are the people like there?
So the people here, obviously it's a mix. And when the Spaniards came, the conquistadors, there was a lot of extinguishing of heritage, just like in North America and in the United States. And so you have a lot of Spanish blood here, and you also have Mayans, and they're very proud of the Mayan heritage. You also have the Inca and Aztec heritage as well, because it's very much a mixing bowl in Central America of all these different genetics. And I think it's made it kind of murky to figure out exactly who's who and what from a historical standpoint. But I will tell you that the local people here are extremely proud of the Mayan heritage. I think mostly because they were considered to be a very peaceful, non-warring, spiritual, connected to nature, definitely connected to the stars and the sun. The Mayans are the ones obviously who created the Mayan calendar and that kind of thing. And this temple at Chichen Itza is set up very much in line with the equinox of spring and fall and the sun and the stars and all sorts of great technological and architectural advancements that were made on these buildings hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years ago.
It's amazing how the more we learn about ancient cultures, whether it's the Mayans or people, in other continents, how much mathematics played a part in their culture, but also in their advancement of technology and building and architecture. And we don't really pay much attention to that. I mean, we have computerized architecture programs that can throw up a building and a plan. Is it reflected in just the everyday living, or how's that feel?
Right. Well, and I think people are so amazed by is that, and just like with the pyramids of Egypt, all of that was done without machines, without engines and cranes. So it was all done by hand, and who knows what kind of other equipment, but the precision with which this was done, at Chichen Itza is pretty spectacular. And I think appropriately is one of the 7 man-made wonders of the world because of it. And what's interesting, like you said, Vince, is that they placed a very high value on architects and scientists, I think, astronomers and mathematicians in this culture, in the Mayan culture, because those were the people that made up royalty. So the people who were smart and understood were in fact elevated in society, probably similar to shamans would be in hunter-gatherer societies. But this was, they placed a much higher emphasis on the ability to keep track of time, probably because of their heavy reliance on farming, because they needed to know how the seasons and the variations of natural elements worked so that they could be most successful with farming. And that was why I'm sure they were so fascinated with the seasons and time.
So tell me about your trek to Chichen Itza, and what did you learn about the Mayans? They kind of disappeared, right? What did you learn from the guides, or what were the people there telling you what happened to the Mayans? And I mean, they're still there culturally, but
yeah, well, genetically, they didn't disappear. There's some accounts in history that said the Mayans just kind of disappeared and they don't know why. And I guess what they mean by that is when you look at these ruins, there's no clear connection between when they were there and why the jungle covered it all up. And when the Spaniards came and took over, mostly the Aztecs and the Incas. So but culturally, they continued on. They just their civilization had died out earlier. And I'm not an expert. I can't really tell you. But what I do know is that sometime around 700 AD or CE, as they like to say now, modern time 700, the Toltecs from north of Mexico City area kind of integrated with the Mayans and changed their cultural. They still consider that to be Mayan heritage, but with a heavy Toltec influence. And that's when you started to see some of the cultural shifts in human sacrifices and various kinds of cultural changes that didn't appear to be part of the Mayan culture from before the Toltec integration.
So there's constant mixing of cultures and populations. I mean, this was happening all over the world. So that was a rapid period of change. What was going on in Europe, and then centuries later, Europeans coming to America, and then a southward invasion by the Spaniards and all that. So when I walk around the city where I live, Joe, and this state, there's a lot of geographical heritage, and you can feel ancestral guides up around the Great Lakes or in the different places around the country in America. But I don't feel a great sense of our ancestors when I'm walking around because, frankly, they all came from Europe and we displaced the people that were here. But what's it like down there in that regard? And you were telling me about some statues that they found that confounded the heritage in a sense there.
Yeah, well, no, that's a good 2-part question. And the first part is the connection both to land and ancestral heritage that is present here that, like you said, isn't really present in North America. Certainly, we have a connection to the land. I think anybody would have connection to any land that they grow up in. And if you open yourself to the spirits of the land, they're there. But what's interesting here is that the people here, at least with Mayan heritage, are connected both ancestrally and to the land, and the two kind of commingle together. But yeah, the interesting fact that I found when we were at Chichen Itza, which really does confound our sense of history and really this narrative that we have about how this continent became populated via the Bering Straits 10,000 years ago, and it wasn't discovered until Leif Erikson or whomever the European was that was able to come across the ocean. But what they found inside this temple that was kind of a inside the inside of the temple, they know that there was a statue there from multiple thousands of years ago. I think like at least 2,500 years ago. They're even wondering if it's older than that, but at least 2,500 years ago. And in the eyes of this statue are jade, a variation of jade that is only found in China. So they know that these eyes that were placed in the statue come from China, from multiple thousands of years ago, and that really has them scratching their heads like, how did they get here, and why are they in the eye sockets of the statue? And I think that it begs a question. Historians sometimes are very quick to dig into their narrative of how things happen. But time and time again, there's data and evidence that we find that goes against that narrative. And this is another piece of that suggests that maybe either people were traveling around more than we knew, or who knows? I don't know.
So Mr. Erickson wasn't the first leaf on the tree down there is basically what we can take from that.
Yeah.
You know, we do have this tendency to write our own history. Finally, I wanted to ask you one thing. I know Mexico is always a timely tourist conversation in terms of safety, and yet this week another story of some security issues with some people that is brewing right now. How did you find it in terms of safety and Mexico being a place that people should or should not feel comfortable to? I know there's some parts that are categorized like Category 4, do not go, but what are you finding?
Yeah, well, and to be honest, it's a very good question, because I wasn't 100% sure when we decided to come here whether it was a good idea because of what I had heard and read. And then as I kind of stripped away the irrational fear, I was able to do a little better research and recognize that there are millions of people who come here every year and never have any kind of problem. We tend to only hear the bad news. And certainly there's plenty of discussion about cartels and open borders and people coming up through Central America and coming across the border. And I think that all gets kind of lumped into this idea of a negative view of Mexico. And I can only speak to what I have personally seen, and that is nothing but warmth and kind, friendly people in the service industry who are very welcoming and very concerned about having a good time and connecting to the heritage. The food here is outstanding. The service is outstanding. Quite frankly, the US dollar goes a long way here. But again, I can only speak to Cozumel. It's been absolutely a wonderful place to go. And I'm glad that I stripped away my fears to look a little deeper and see that it's perfectly okay.
It's definitely a concern, something people should think about. But the reality is that life these days is not perfectly secure anywhere. And I suppose taking the precautions and watching and knowing and doing the research is probably the best way to go about it. Now, for people who haven't been there, you mentioned the great food. Does it have a sort of cultural flavor to it? Is it Indian, Mexican down there? What's it like?
Well, when I went to Greece, I came back and told everybody, Turns out the Greeks are really good at Greek salads. And I can say the same thing here. Turns out the Mexicans are really good at Mexican food because it's like nothing you ever had. The corn tortillas that you use for tacos are made with a grain and a texture to it that you don't get in that ultra processed corn flour that we get, in North America. So the food is great. The spices are not. You can ask for hot, spicy if you want to, and they give you that option, but a lot of cilantro and lime. Well, Sonia and I have become huge fans of a tradition, which is lime soup. And so it's a lime-based flavored chicken soup, and it is spectacular. And everything's fresh because you've got vegetables that are grown and ripened right on the vine down here. So everything is really kind of fresh and very delicious, and spices are not too much at all. If anything, it's quite good.
So I imagine that traveling to another country these days is pretty much back to normal with people in the airport and long lines and not the greatest service. That's been sort of the way we deal with things now. But tell me what it's like down there. Now that you're there, what's the geography like? What's some of the things you've been doing? Have you been snorkeling?
I don't know if you know this, but there was a movie years ago called Against All Odds. And that was Phil Collins won I think an Oscar for that song in that movie. And that was filmed here on Cozumel. I think there was a fair amount of diving involved in that movie, underwater activity and that kind of thing. So yes, this is quite the destination for snorkeling and diving. We're snorkelers. And then also there's the jungle around us, and they have jaguars and various kinds of, wild animals here that I could not enumerate them all, but
are you able to keep them at bay?
Well, we haven't gone too deep into the jungle, but I think they're real and they come out at night. But in fact, what I heard is that our guide one of the days told us that during COVID, some of the animals, when the humans weren't here, the animals started taking over some of the resorts. For sure in Cancun that happened, that they had difficulties, not with human looters, but with animal looters. It didn't take them long to come back in. And I can tell you that the fish population is alive and well around the reefs here in Cozumel, because I've snorkeled quite a bit, and it's been quite a show of snorkeling. It's been very fun.
So when the humans go away, the jaguars find out that laying on a poolside chair by the warm weather and trees isn't such a bad place, huh?
Yeah, get the humans out of the way and they can have some of the good places too.
Well, it's good to get the humans out of the way best we can. It's good to get outside of ourselves. And Joe, have a safe travel back. We've got some trees here for you to get cut up. And just so you know that the forecast for when you return is supposed to get super, super cold. So enjoy your warm climb. And
well, it's been great wandering with you, Vince, and I enjoyed our conversation. But now I will very much enjoy going back to the beach.
You do that. Yeah, bye-bye now. Gladly go back to the beach. I got your beach right here, you son of a bitch. Ooh, whoops, we're still on the air. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to another episode of Friends in Wonder. And while we go out and clean off the snow and the ice and the branches and the wires that have fallen, may the spirit be with you. Thanks again for listening. Join us again next week on Friends in Wonder.